really welcome you to this session looking at whether or not conversion therapy should be banned or not, which seems to be very controversial at the moment, and I hope we'll be able to have a very civil discussion about it. I'm going to ask Lord Stewart Jackson, first of all, to outline really what the conversion bill discussions in Parliament have all been about, because I think that for those of us who are not really in the weeds looking at these particular issues, the whole thing has become very confusing. I've been given two different leaflets today. One confusingly titled The Campaign for a Conversion Therapy Bill, but which actually, when you read it, is about the problems of the campaign for the Conversion Therapy Bill, and which outlines from the Christian Institute their perspectives on why we shouldn't have this. But then we also have Modern Conversion Therapy, which is a poster that's been put out by the Sex Matters organisation. So there's lots of bits of literature that are flying around that are referring to this. So Lord Jackson will explain to us what this is really all about. And then we're going to go on and hear kind of short provocation little talks of about 5 minutes from, in the following order, Bev Jackson, who is from the Lesbian and Gay Alliance, from Katie John Went, who's a D&I educator and has been speaking on some of the other panels here. We have Stephanie Davies-Arai from Transgender Trend, and last but not least, Dolan Cummings, who will be familiar to many of you here from his writings on conscience and other things. So let's hear from the speakers first, and then we'll move out into what I'm hoping will be an educating debate. So, Lord Jackson.
Thank you, Anne, very much for that. And can I begin by expressing my warmest thanks and appreciation to Claire Fox, who's my colleague in the Lords, who is a great speaker and activist, and obviously has done a great job in pulling this event together over the years. So thank you to Claire. Anna's sort of more or less given you the impression I'm a disinterested observer and I'm impartial on this, perhaps as giving you an overview. I'm not actually. I am very partisan on this, and I'm very hostile to the idea of a conversion therapy ban being incorporated into primary legislation for the reasons that I'm about to tell you. Where we are today is that there has been great speculation throughout this year that a piece of primary legislation, a conversion therapy banning bill, would be included into the King's Speech, which is going to be on the 7th of November. My understanding is that that is not likely to happen. There will not be a standalone bill for a number of reasons. One is it's proved impossible in the last 4.5 years to write a bill, but also what will happen, I think it's likely to happen, that there will be a draft bill published probably before Christmas or early next year, which will require what they call 12 weeks of pre-legislative scrutiny, which is a joint committee of both Houses of Commons and the Lords will look at the efficacy of the proposed bill and make recommendations, and then the government will come forward with a bill at a later juncture. Now, because we have to have a general election probably by Christmas next year, technically by January 25, the likelihood of a bill being published, getting its first reading, second reading, committee stage, report stage, third reading in the Commons, then doing all the same again, and then having ping-pong, what we call ping-pong of amendments between the two houses, and then getting royal assent by the time Parliament is dissolved for a general election, I think is extremely unlikely. But nevertheless, for all that, I've been asked to give an overview and to explain why Parliament is getting involved in this issue. LGBT groups didn't really start campaigning for a ban until 2018. A recurring claim was that banning, quote, conversion therapy, unquote, meant stopping horrendous things like electroshock experiments and corrective rape intended to make gay men and lesbians straight. We'd all agree with stopping these things, but there's no evidence of either of them happening in the UK, at least not in recent decades. And if they did, they would, of course, be unlawful. But it was against this backdrop of claims about abuses that don't actually take place in the UK that Theresa May's government got involved. They did a survey of LGBT people asking if they'd experienced conversion therapy. It apparently found, quote, 2% of all respondents reported having undergone conversion therapy in an attempt to, quote, cure them of being LGBT, and a further 5% reported having been offered it. That led to Theresa May saying she would consult on what to do about it. And in 2020, Boris Johnson said he would bring in a ban. Interestingly, at variance with media reports, Theresa May's government was careful not to promise a ban. It said that it would consult how best to, quote, end conversion therapy. Theresa May and Penny Mordaunt appeared keen on a full ban, but that was not the party's position until Boris Johnson became leader. You could understand all of that if the survey revealed people were suffering terrible abuses without any recourse to law, but it didn't. Let me read to you from a Downing Street memo that was leaked to ITV News last year. Quote, the survey was not designed to elicit detail on conversion therapy practices. We were not able to conclude whether those who reported being subjected to therapies were reflecting on recent events, incidents in the UK, or to say whether they had experienced what was already covered by existing legislation. Her Majesty's Government Commission research has shown that the evidence base for further legislative measures on conversion therapy is weak, unquote. And that's the problem. The real problem is lack of definition. One of the problems of the survey was that it didn't actually define what conversion therapy is. This problem of lack of definition has dogged the conversation ever since. Apparently the term is very, very elastic. In 2021, the Conservative MP Alicia Kearns declared that, quote, conversion therapy can range from therapy and prayer sessions to aversive treatments like electroshocks or even, quote, corrective rape. I think therapists and vicars will be surprised to see their daily work placed on the same spectrum as ECT and rape. That's why you've got therapists like James Esses campaigning against a ban, because he knows trans activists would use it to get him locked up for doing open-ended therapy with gender-confused young people instead of just putting them on a conveyor belt to gender reassignment. It's also why you've got thousands of church leaders campaigning against a ban, because they're worried that they'll be reported to the police for, say, praying with a gay person. The leading pro-ban activist is Jane Ozanne. She's very angry with traditional churches for not agreeing with her about some LGBT issues. When a liberal bishop suggested that perhaps, quote, gentle non-coercive prayer, unquote, could be excluded from the ban, she strongly disagreed. It doesn't matter to her if your prayer is gentle and non-coercive. If you don't agree with her, she wants your prayers outlawed. This is the issue of free speech. I hope our discussion today, we can get past the idea that opposing a bill on conversion therapy means you support the brutalising of gay and trans people. It's not about that, it's about free speech. Here's why I think we can be sure about that. There's no point banning something that doesn't actually happen in this country. It would be illegal if it did. Activists know this, and so the ban must be aimed at something else. Verbal and physical abuse are outlawed in the UK, so is domestic coercion, and medical malpractice will get you drummed out of the profession. Supporters of a ban want a law that goes much further. They want to outlaw the expression of certain ideas in the presence of certain LGBT people. Look at the situation in Victoria, Australia. The official guidance for their conversion therapy ban says it's now illegal for parents to refuse to support their children going on puberty blockers. That same guidance even tells religious people what they can and cannot say in their prayers. You shouldn't be surprised about that, of course, because people get arrested for saying silent prayers outside of an abortion clinic in Birmingham, but apparently you can say jihad, jihad, jihad in London, and that's fine. Alicia Kearns and Jane Ozanne have both stated that the conversion therapy ban in Australia is a good one and that the UK should adopt it. But what happens next? Will they get their way? I'm dismayed, and I have to say as a Conservative of 40 years standing, I'm embarrassed that this government is even toying with that. It was not actually in the manifesto, and it's a canard to say it was. This is the situation. It was not mentioned in the 2017 or 2019 manifesto, despite many mistaken claims. There was an LGBT action plan from 2018, and it did say the government would end conversion therapy, but the action plan was not part of the manifesto. I'm being told to wind up, so I will wind up very quickly. We should ditch the whole notion of a bill and simply reassure gay and trans people that they are protected from abuse by existing law. If they go to a therapist or a church and they really do feel they've been abused, they should report it to the police. If what they heard there breaches law, the CPS can prosecute. If it doesn't, it means that whatever was said to them was not abusive, and their best bet is to find a therapist or a church that agrees with them. So to close, there were two options, which can be summed up by the approaches of the Netherlands and Sweden. In both countries, legal assessments were carried out to see if a law on conversion therapy was needed. In both cases, the assessment found that abusive practices were already illegal. In the Netherlands, politicians have decided to press ahead anyway. They want a new law, quote, for situations where no abuse takes place. But in Sweden, on the other hand, it looks like the government will do the sensible thing and drop the plan. And ladies and gentlemen, I think we should do the same.
Thank you very much, Lord Jackson. It's quite reassuring for me to find out, I think, that my confusion about it is perhaps not so much my own stupidity as the fact that there seem to be many things about the proposed legislation that seem to be quite difficult. What I'm still struggling to understand, and maybe other speakers will be able to clarify this, is what do they mean by conversion? Is this just changing minds? What do we mean by therapy? Because even within mainstream therapeutic practice, there seems to be lots of discussion about what this is. But we're going to move on to hear from Bev Jackson from the LGB Alliance.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I agree with very much of what we've just heard, but I can report that things move so quickly in this field that the situation in the Netherlands has actually changed since Lord Jackson wrote his remarks, and in fact the outgoing government has decided that this is a controversial matter, and a recent documentary was put out in mainstream TV in the Netherlands just a couple of days ago, and the situation on the ground in the Netherlands where I live is changing very rapidly. Anyway, I'd like to start off by saying that as Lord Jackson says, we don't have the horrible practices that most people imagine that are meant by conversion therapy, such as chemical castration, and most notably with Alan Turing in the 1950s, or the stimulation with electrical nodes that happened up until the 1970s, and that is why Stonewall never campaigned on a bill to ban conversion therapy, because it doesn't exist, hadn't existed since the 1970s. And Kate Harris, with whom I founded LGB Alliance, and who was a proud supporter of Stonewall for many, many decades, can report, and so can others, that Stonewall never even discussed it. So it is indeed about something else. And we believe that this the ban on so-called conversion therapy, and I'll come to what these words mean in a minute, is a key component of the strategy of people who seek to roll back the rights of women and homosexuals, I use this word so that we really know what we're talking about, and to eliminate child safeguarding. And this strategy has three parts, and we sometimes call it the triptych of legislation. First, introduce self-ID, which queers, that is to say, muddles up, confuses, blurs the definitions of man, woman, gay, and lesbian. Second, enact a ban on what is deceptively referred to as conversion therapy. And third, pass hate speech laws to ensure that those of us who question all this will be criminalised. We need to be aware of this agenda, and if we care about the rights and interests of homosexuals and of women and of children, to vigorously oppose it. Now, the phrase conversion therapy is, of course, an oxymoron, and there's a lot of language games going on here. Therapy is about providing treatment to cure or alleviate a disorder or to help alleviate distress. And it does not mean conversion, which is pushing someone towards a particular direction. So there's no such thing as conversion therapy anyway. And in fact, the government has recognized this and now refers to conversion practices, which is at least partway intelligible. I would like also to encourage everyone to stop talking about LGBT people. It is misleading and leads to hopeless confusion. I'm afraid there was some confusion in the introduction to this panel, which you read about the sexual orientation of trans children. This is not, this is a confusion which is, I believe, partly at least deliberate. LGB is about sexual orientation. It's about who you fancy. It's about relationships. It's about who you're attracted to, what your sexual orientation is. All these other letters that have been stuck on the end and more keep being added all the time are about something else. They're about gender identity, apparently. So that's a feeling that some people, certainly not all people, but some people have about themselves. Trying to discuss the rights of LGBT people makes no more sense than talking about the rights of vegans and chicken farmers. They are separate and sometimes opposing issues. We have to use another culinary metaphor, unscramble the omelette. We need to split LGB from TQ and all the other letters. This is particularly important when it comes to plans to ban conversion practices. Since gay conversion therapy is thankfully virtually non-existent in the UK, what is this ban really about? The real focus of the activists has nothing to do with gay conversion practices. It's all about gender identity, and mostly about young people. We have long known that most children who feel like the opposite sex because they don't conform to outdated sexist stereotypes grow up to be gay or lesbian. I'm going to read you a quote. Gender identity disorders in infancy, childhood, and adolescence are complex and have varied causes. In the majority of cases, the eventual outcome will be homosexuality or bisexuality. Only a small proportion of cases will result in a transsexual outcome. That quote comes from the trans youth organisation Mermaids, just over 20 years ago. Since then, Mermaids has completely changed its tune. Now advocates puberty blockers for kids who feel they are in the wrong body, and I would like to make it quite clear that nobody is born in the wrong body. We all know that. There are questions to be asked about how Mermaids and why Mermaids changed its stance, because it is still today, it's about LGB teenagers. And there have been two major changes in the past, say, 15 years or so, an over 4,000% increase in the number of children distressed about their gender identity, and a complete reversal in the sex ratio. It used to be mostly boys, from quite an early age actually, who thought they were girls, and at the moment, at least 2/3, some people say 3/4 of kids referred to gender clinics and often demanding puberty blockers are teenage girls. The vast majority of them are only attracted to other girls. It's clear there is research on this. They don't want to describe themselves as lesbian. I can't possibly wind up in 1 minute, so sorry.
I'm bowed.
Please.
I'm liberal on this.
Please read the reports in Time to Talk by Hannah Barnes. What has all this got to do with conversion practices? The ban seeks to outlaw exploratory psychotherapy. They seek to impose the gender-affirming approach. If a girl says she is a boy, then he is a boy. Challenging or questioning that would be conversion therapy. And as Lord Jackson referred to the bill in Victoria, Australia, therapists who do question it and say, well, why did you come to think you were a boy, face up to 10 years in prison. And the result is those therapists do not dare to take those children on, and those children are left completely without care. It's a scandal, and we must not have that in this country. So, the question we should be asking is, why are so many politicians and activists eager to stop young LGB people going through puberty, which is the way children mature into adults? We should also ask why so few people know about this medical scandal, and why they are led to believe that most gay and lesbian people think puberty blockers are marvellous and girls who have mastectomies are stunning and brave. The lack of impartiality in the mainstream media, essentially banning the views of LGB Alliance from being heard, is a serious problem and is doing the public a profound disservice. Thank you, GB News, for being the rare exception. Every child has the right to go through puberty, and no one has the right to stop it. This session asked if a ban on conversion therapy would interfere with freedom. We do curtail the freedom of children in all sorts of ways, such as in smoking, drinking, even tattoos. We are right to do so. It's about safeguarding. Clinicians at the Tavistock Youth Clinic, GIDS, joked, soon there will be no gay kids left. Those wanting to ban what they call transgender conversion therapy are trying to give children a kind of freedom that actually violates their rights and interests. Let's stop transing away the gay and provide better mental health care for gender-distressed children.
Okay. Thank you very much. Calm down. We appreciate we have other speakers to go, and I hope that the vociferous applause that is being given here is not going to be intimidating for those of you who might disagree, because otherwise we're going to have a very boring discussion afterwards. Beginning to sound quite a lot to me as though banning conversion therapy is a bit like trying to ban changing a young person's mind about what they might be thinking, but there's probably more to it than this. Katie John, let us have your views.
How do I follow that? In part by slightly agreeing with everything that's gone to date already. So I may surprise some people. I spoke on a panel here last year and actually mentioned that at that panel then I had experienced conversion therapy, and also that it doesn't work. And we've heard a couple of phrases already, including pray away the gay and stop transing away the gay. Well, I experienced pray away the trans. I'm also one of those weirdo people that actually knocked on every door possible to try and kind of get rid of being trans. I sought the help of psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, and the then church that I was in as well at the time, over a period of at least 15 years, 20 years nearly, trying everything to avoid it. My own psychiatrist called me the most reluctant transsexual he'd ever met. So I have some experience of my own journey of legitimately looking for therapies that might get rid of it. And I kind of want to say at the start that I approve of banning conversion therapy in principle, but cannot find a form of words that would ever make it acceptable to ban. So it's kind of like, how do you ban something that you can't define? How do you ban something that barely happens? When the surveys of people under Theresa May found 2% had experienced it, 5% had been offered it. Other surveys show other numbers, but again, how do you define what it is they're actually saying, yes, they experienced? I have a friend who was a therapist and kind of offers therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction, which was a way of rephrasing pray away the gay. Because he himself was closet gay, but came from a religious perspective that didn't agree with it. I have plenty of friends who were in the ex-gay movement and then became proponents of pray away the gay. They all went back to being gay. There's the ex-gay movement now. And I was a fundamentalist Christian, so I was part of that for a long time. And I believe, for example, that prayer was the answer. So if I were to ban conversion therapy, I would be banning the religious end of the market, but equally my free speech hat on says you can't ban that. And so I am torn between what can you ban, what should you ban, what I don't like. What I don't like doesn't mean it shouldn't exist. I think it's impossible. I think therapists do a fantastic job. I don't think there are enough therapists out there to help teens going through questioning and 20s going through questioning still. I actually, I had a nice cocktail at lunch with actually the mother of a trans kid, and she couldn't even find a gender therapist for them because they're all booked up with lists as long as the gender identity clinics. And actually she was looking for a neutral therapist for them because she wanted to delay for as long as possible her child's possible choices down that route. And I was supporting that delay because I'm very much of the opinion, watch and wait as long as you bloody can. In the hope that it does go away. I firmly believe that being trans is a last resort, not a first choice. And I think, therefore, the risks with conversion therapy ban is that it will end up banning explorative therapy. I don't know, it's very hard to define what is exploratory therapy and what is affirmative and all the rest of it. I don't believe in affirmative therapy at all. I do believe in affirming a person, but not necessarily affirming their beliefs. If they think they're a chicken, they're not going to affirm it, am I? I believe biology is real, but I believe that gender identity dysphoria is real. The dysphoria is real. The dysphoria is hell. I lived with it, and actually, surgery got rid of it. I still want to know why. So I want to create a space in which it is possible to still explore these ideas. I want to create a space where people feel when they're going through it, there are neutral people they can talk to that will neither affirm nor deny and will just hold space for you to discover and to realize there are multiple options out there and there are multiple causes out there, and what you think it is now may not be what it is. Last year we heard from someone on the panel, a brave woman who talked about the fact that when she was a teen she thought she was a trans boy, but actually at 18 she had breast reduction, and that solved what was more of a body dysmorphia than a gender dysphoria. We know now that 25 to even 50% of kids have autistic spectrum in coincidental and comorbid with being trans, mental health, and a bunch of other things besides. Puberty is hell. Nobody enjoys it particularly. And unless there's, again, a supportive environment to go through that, and just because you're in a particular year group doesn't mean you all go through it at the same pace. I didn't experience a male puberty till I was 19 because I had a puberty disorder. And that meant I was completely out of sync and out of body and out of character and not feeling like any of the other boys. Of course I'm going to question, does that mean I'm something else? But there was no space to question that. There was no one to talk to. So I think we need more talking therapies, but they need to be as neutral as possible, but as supportive as possible. And I would rather the energies going into trying to ban conversion therapy were put in to try and create more therapies. I do have some reluctance with the form of words used by Sex Matters with the banning modern conversion therapy, now that the idea that being trans is a conversion therapy itself of gay people. I would rather have been gay. Hell yeah, easier, compared to the trans hell journey. I do think there are some people for whom that is the issue. If you come from a religious household or a religious upbringing, then being gay can be seen as the worst of the two evils, and being trans being the lesser of them. We know that's the case in countries where it's completely banned, like Iran. That's the second largest number of trans surgeries in the world. Because it's okay to be trans, it's not okay to be gay. So I'm not going to say it's absolutely not the case, but I think most of the time it isn't the case. So what I'm trying to say, I think, really is that we've got to create the space for therapy, not to actually ban it. And I think we should have the discussion about banning it because it creates a good discussion. And therefore, the fact that we're having it is good, but I don't think it will come to anything. Political time is going to run out anyway. But I think we should be kind of actually putting teens and people who want help first. And actually, I think the biggest thing we have is a lack of resources in the whole child and adolescent mental health sphere, both within the NHS and within the external therapists. The wait to see a therapist is pretty much as long as the wait to see a gender identity specialist, so-called. And that wait is itself the biggest era and period of distress. And for someone growing up fast and going through puberty, taking 18 months to even see someone is going to increase that distress, and the only place you're going to go in that 18 months is the internet. to find answers, and the only answers you're going to get from your kind of bubble, your social media bubble, is going to be affirmation. So you don't even have to worry about affirmation therapists because you're getting affirmation friends and affirmation social media. So I guess I would kind of leave that there, really. So probably not what you expected me to say, I don't know.
Thanks very much, Katie John, and I think we should take to heart that space to question, which I hope that you're going to do in a few minutes' time. But before you start questioning, I'd like to hear from Stephanie Davies-Arai.
We already have a ban on gender identity conversion therapy. In 2017, gender identity was added to the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy, the MOU, which is the professional practice guide for the therapy and counselling professional bodies. So we already have a ban on so-called gender identity or trans conversion therapy within a professional guideline that all counsellors must follow. What we don't have is any evidence of how the addition of gender identity in what's known as MOU2 has impacted on the therapists and counsellors who must abide by it. So when the government first sought evidence about the prevalence of conversion therapy for trans people, the professional bodies who are signatories to the MOU2, including NHS England, had no evidence to provide. It's been 6 years. In all that time, no evidence has been gathered about the impact on the practice of counsellors and therapists. But we do know that it's had a very chilling effect among therapists and clinicians working with children who are distressed about their gender. We know this anecdotally from all the parents who contact us who can't find a therapist who will do anything other than affirm their child's opposite sex identity. We know it from the testimonies of professionals, for example, from Thoughtful Therapist, Critical Therapy Antidote. We know that therapists have felt afraid to do anything but affirm a child's gender identity. And we know it from the CAS interim report, which references this several times throughout that report, that clinicians at the Tavistock felt pressured to follow an unquestioning affirmative approach towards distressed children. And CAS spoke of the diagnostic overshadowing that was a result of the focus on gender. In other words, as soon as a child says they're trans, all other factors are ignored. These might include mental health problems, neurodevelopmental issues, previous trauma, and struggles with sexual orientation. So a ban on trans conversion therapy means the establishment of the gender affirmative approach in English law. To think it would be possible to protect therapists would be hopelessly naive. We've seen the impact of one ban, and this would only make it worse. CAS has rejected the gender affirmative approach in the new model that she's setting up for the new gender clinic hubs that will replace the Tavistock, which is being closed. A conversion therapy bill would undermine and in fact be in direct opposition to CAS's work to bring the service into line with normal standards of paediatric care. So why would activists be aggressively lobbying for a bill to ban conversion therapy now? I mean, it may have been necessary 3 decades ago, but now, why now? Gay conversion therapy doesn't happen anymore. It was never an issue for Stonewall until they adopted the T and became a trans activist group. And this is real Denton's playbook stuff. So the Denton's report was written by Denton's, the law firm, Thomas Reuters, and Iglio, which is the lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, intersex, youth and student organisation, something like that, wrote a report giving advice on how to get gender self-ID into law, into legislation. The report was called Only Adults, Good Practices in Legal Gender Recognition for Youth. And what it attempted to do was take away parental rights and be able to transition children freely. And one of their recommendations was to attach the campaign for gender self-ID to a more popular campaign so that people don't notice, and keep it out of the press so that people don't know about it, and get these laws in behind the scenes. And that acronym LGBT in itself does that. It serves to cover up gender self-ID behind a veneer of gay rights. So people hear LGBT and they think it means gay people. And LGBT conversion therapy is a complete misnomer. And if you notice, all of the organisations that campaign for it have extended that acronym. So they now talk about LGBTQ plus conversion therapy and more. And which is what will happen if an LGBT law goes in. It will be added to, and all of those minority gender and sexual identities appear to have no ceiling. We don't know what they include. The government must not make the mistake of combining LGB and T in legislation. You cannot put the two things together in law. Every time LGBT is used by government, it covers up what's really happening. The worst example I know is Stonewall inserted a passage into the Department for Education's safeguarding Bible, keeping children safe in education, that says if a child announces they're LGBT, it's not a safeguarding issue. So they hide completely the fact that a girl telling a teacher that she's a lesbian is a very different thing to a girl telling a teacher that she's a boy. If we look at the wording of the Memorandum of Understanding 2, it says therapists must not favour one gender identity over another gender identity. So this is a radical reinterpretation of reality itself. If you imagine it, a troubled, say autistic, possibly lesbian teenage girl says to her therapist, I think I'm a boy, I identify as a boy, that the therapist must think, well, that's as good a gender idea as any, no problem, nothing to see there, and just ask her pronouns. And if you think of that situation for a parent, for a teacher, for a social worker, because I've talked about the chilling effect that the MOU2 has had on therapists, but it has spread wider than that. It's spread to other professionals who work with children, and parents themselves are afraid, and it has already happened in the UK that parents have been reported to social services because they haven't affirmed their children. So to not favour one gender ID over another gender identity requires a belief in gender identity, that it exists as a thing independent of biology, socialisation or cultural influence. Therapists are not required to adopt the beliefs of their patients. That's not therapy. In fact, it's the antithesis of therapy. Parents, teachers and social workers are not required to adopt the beliefs of children in their care. So as a conversion therapy bill including gender identity would be a bill that cancels itself out. Ostensibly protection for gay youth on the one hand, it takes that protection away with the other and puts gay youth at risk of the new form of conversion therapy that has really swept the globe over the last decade, gender affirmation and gender affirmative care. Changing a child's sex, which is what's really happening, not gender identity, by definition changes their sexual orientation. And it's the gay and lesbian young people who are most at risk of this. Gender affirmation is gay conversion therapy, by definition. We commissioned a legal opinion on a conversion therapy bill that included gender identity from Jeremy Hyam, KC. And he said, to introduce a bill, you need evidence. You need evidence that the bill is necessary. And the bill must be proportionate and necessary. This bill is neither, and no government should bring it forward.
Okay, finally to sum up, Dolan.
Thanks, Anne. I just want to take a step back for a few minutes and just look at the more general role of morality in public debate and what I think is a shift to moralisation of certain issues. I mean, traditionally in British politics, there were certain conscience issues, like abortion and euthanasia, which it was understood that people of good faith could disagree on, and so often the political parties would give a free vote to people to go with their conscience on that. And those still kind of linger as we understand it in those terms, although if you look in the actual debates on those, they do get quite fierce, as Anne will know. Debates about the good faith is not necessarily assumed on either side. But I think in a post-Christian society that we're in now, one of the few moral absolutes that we kind of all agree on is anti-racism. We see racism as being abhorrent. And to the extent that when we argue about racism, we're not arguing, some people think racism is a good thing, some people think racism is a bad thing. We argue about what is and isn't racist. You know, is cultural appropriation racist? Is this or that kind of immigration controls racist? But if anyone is called racist, they're very upset and say, no, I'm not. And they will push back strongly and argue on those terms. And I think that the concept of homophobia has developed kind of by analogy with racism. To bring it in as another moral absolute. It's absolutely wrong to be prejudiced against gay people, or to think that homosexuality is not a normal variation of human sexuality. So I think that the term homophobia suggests that there isn't a disagreement over morality here. It's about whether you're a good person or a bigot. So the term phobia partly does that, but it's also, notice, it's not like claustrophobia or agoraphobia or an irrational fear of buttons. You can't say, oh, forgive me, I've got a bit of homophobia. I'm a bit homophobic. It doesn't work like that, does it? It's immoral. When we talk about homophobia, it's making a moral judgment, not a clinical one. So I think whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, what that's led to is a narrowing of what you might call the moral Overton window. You know, the sphere of what's acceptable to believe in moral terms rather than just political terms. And maybe that's a good thing, that we don't entertain anti-gay prejudice. But I do think it's very clear that that's led to this new idea of transphobia. And the way that the term transphobia is used, again, is to say, well, this isn't a disagreement over anything. It's about your bigotry. To call someone transphobic is to say that you're a bigot and to suggest them of a moral failing. And unlike racism, it's not easy for most of us to say, no, I'm not transphobic, because I'm not sure what transphobia is. And I think that's the problem. And when it comes up around the issue of conversion therapy, you know, you might say, well, I'm not transphobic because I don't hate trans people. I wish trans people well. I want to give them rights and so on, or they should have the same rights as everyone else, to put it more straightforwardly. But often there's a pushback that says, well, no, that's not good enough. If you disagree with banning conversion therapy, then you are transphobic. If you disagree with the ideology that says some people are simply born with a gender that disagrees with their biology, if you disagree with the idea that actually it's normal and to be expected that a certain proportion of people are trans, that those things are seen as transphobic. And as an attempt to bring all the kind of moral force that come through homophobia and before that through racism and say you're just a bad person if you don't go along with this. And ultimately I just think it doesn't work, because we don't agree on on the issues of trans and trans ideology in the way that we agree about racism being definitely wrong. So that's, I think, that where we've come to. I think the term transphobia is not helpful for that reason. The question I have that I want to raise, or difficulty, I'm not sure you can draw a straight line saying, well, let's agree homophobia is definitely wrong, but not transphobia. So there's an open debate about what trans is and isn't, and what we should do with kids who have gender dysphoria, or adults with gender dysphoria, but we're all going to agree that, that homosexuality is completely normal, and anyone who thinks otherwise is a bigot. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you can draw that line, but is that what we want to do? Because I'd suggest if we want to have a more open understanding around the trans debate and push back the Overton window, not so people can be horrible and bigoted and prejudiced, but so people can openly express how they feel about and how they understand the issue. And maybe the same goes a little bit for homosexuality and what we understand by that. So I'll throw that as a provocation, and hopefully we can pull it through the discussion.
Okay, some really good points made by all the speakers here. I'm going to throw it open for discussions. I normally say, and we normally say here, we're happy to take points as well as questions. Don't feel that you have to ask a question. I want to say, don't feel that you have to make a point. You can just ask a question, because a couple of questions that I'd just like to throw out in the context of all of this is really, is it a problem? Do we think it's a problem to try to change someone's sense of identity? Or indeed, is it a problem to try and change someone's identity? I mean, this isn't just an issue that comes up in the sexual identity or gender identity issues. It seems to me that it happens in other areas as well. I rocked up to a debate on abortion that I'd been invited to as the pro-choice speaker with a group of Christian evangelists who were all praying for me to change my identity. I've worked as an abortion provider for nearly 20 years, which would be a fundamental assault on me. It's not working, although I think I'm very much prayed for. But is it a problem to try and change someone's identity? Is it a problem to override the judgment of therapists, the clinical judgment of therapists, the parental judgment of parents to do what they think is right for their children? How do these things fit in? Let's try and broaden the scope of the discussion and not make it too narrow. So who'd like to speak?
Thank you. So yes, I'm interested. I'm studying psychology, masters at the moment, and I'm really interested, and I think it was either Bev or Kate on GB News at the Conservative conference mentioned something around, the fact that we've seen such a decrease in body dysmorphia cases, particularly girls, having eating disorders, and the move towards gender identity, if you like, gender dysphoria. We talk about social contagions, talk about autism. We don't affirm someone's eating disorder, so why would we affirm another medical health disorder, which I believe having gender dysphoria is? So yeah, just question to the panels. We don't affirm one mental health condition because that would be killing someone. Why would we affirm another mental health condition like this? Thank you.
Okay.
I agree broadly with most of the points the panel have made, but I would also put to them that the scale of religious activity with regards to what would fall under conversion therapy, even though a lot of the points made with praying with your vicar at local church, quite harmless, shouldn't be criminalised, but I do know somebody who is a gay Muslim who was subjected to an exorcism, and perhaps that's a rare outlier, but I would posit, more extreme activities like that, where would they fall under potential conversion therapy debates?
Okay, I'm going to take a few more before we come back to the panel in front of you.
It was actually rather a narrow question. There was some discussion of the proposed conversion therapy ban simply not happening because of the lack of parliamentary time. On the other hand, based on the assumption that we may see a Labour government within a year or so, what do people with sort of knowledge of likely Labour Party policy on this issue, the divisions, debating, etc., what's going to happen, do you think, there? Do you think there will be more of a drive for Labour to reintroduce this bill in some form?
Okay, I'm going to take a few more, then get the speakers to respond.
I have a more basic question. When I was a child, many years ago, I was what you would define as a tomboy. Whenever we did any kind of role play, I wanted to be John Wayne. I didn't want to be Annie Coakley or what have you. But I never ever thought of myself as a boy. I always thought of myself as a girl, and I still think of myself as a biological female. So the thing I'm not clear about, without asking for a history of the past few years, is how we got to a situation where, because if that happened today, I would probably be well, actually my parents would never have allowed it, but I would probably be in therapy.
I'm Mary, and I'm with Thoughtful Therapists, so it's very good you brought up about the Memorandum of Understanding, because actually what's happening is there is a chilling effect, and it's like the basic thing was not really allowed to do proper therapy. And Katie, actually, we do know what exploratory therapy is. It's a space where you can think, when you can challenge, but language needs to be clear. And that's something that's really, this obfuscation of language is just a cover-up. And it's extremely dangerous in our profession. We have tried engaging with our professional membership. We've been asking questions. We've been, trying to say, look, basically, people do not need gender specialists. Kids just need therapy. There is a link, I think, is very underfunded in CAMS, but all this gender specialism is just pathologising children who just need to, think and play. And as David Bell said, we're stealing their imagination. We're interfering with them. And I think therapy has been part of the problem. But and I really like the Sex Matters actually, challenging and saying that the new, I know it's a bit confusing with all this because I think that's deliberate, is actually that the new conversion therapy is affirmation. You don't just affirm somebody as they come in the room. It's much more exciting and interesting than that.
Thanks very much. Right, I'm going to take a couple more and then ask a couple of questions of the panel.
I just checked. I'm not knowingly breaking the law in Victoria and Australia because they're all asleep, but I am knowingly breaking the law in Canada, and I'm proud of it. By which I mean I'm helping people help their children reject an incongruent gender identity. Stephanie touched on this with the Denton's Playbook remark. I think the underlying motive of this is to try and get gender entrenched in the UK law. And I was just wondering whether the panel had a view on whether the whole concept of gender identity should be in UK law at all. And by that I mean the Gender Recognition Act and Gender Reassignment in the Equality Act. We probably need to get rid of those as well as getting rid of any idea of having a conversion therapy ban. But my general point is you can ban it, but it won't work because people will get around bad law. Bad law will be undermined.
Hi, Anne, it was just what you were saying about the evangelical experience I'm afraid you had to go through, which reminded me of a time that I had to deal with. In a previous life, I directed a music festival, part of a directorship there. And one of the major venues was in a church, a big church, and part of the deal was that there would be a sermon by the priest. Fine. The first night, the speech, I found that it was homophobic, it was transphobic, it was incredibly offensive to the large gay community which were in the audience. We took legal advice to see if this lady could be removed from introducing every night to the festival. I'm afraid every response we had a chilling 3-word defence which couldn't be got round, and it was simply, as a Christian. And there was no way we could get round that. And I think while we're in this topic and it's being discussed, perhaps it's time for the church to have a long look at their outdated views and perhaps time to update them.
Okay. I'm going to take a couple of points back from the panel. If there's somebody who'd like to take up, I'm looking at you two really, on particularly the increasing amount of gender dysphoria and so on, or any other points that you'd like to address. Lord Jackson, can you come back on what's likely to happen on Labour? If you guys want to say anything else, you can. Go.
I just want to say a couple of words to the lady who talked about the fact that we don't affirm mental disorders. We are not allowed to call gender dysphoria a mental disorder. And that is a huge problem. And if you look in the UN guidance and other international documents, it has been removed from the list of mental disorders, and that is a huge problem. It is, to me, and I think to most people here, quite obvious that if you think there's something wrong with your body and you need to remove parts of your body, that you have a mental disorder. We are not allowed to say that. It is a taboo subject, and I think that's a great problem.
Can I just ask you on that? Can it still be called dysphoria, though? Because that seems to imply that there is something wrong about it.
It's a feeling of profound distress. I think if you look in the WPATH description, Stephanie can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a feeling of profound distress, I think we're allowed to call it, but we're not allowed to call it a mental disorder. Am I right about that, Stephanie?
Yeah, I think a lot of work has been done to say it's not a mental disorder, but what is it then? Because it's not a physical disorder. And why, and therefore, why is it treated on the NHS? I think that it ties in with what Keith said. No, gender identity, the concept of gender identity should not be in UK legislation because it's a belief. And if it goes into the conversion therapy bill, it's protecting one belief above others. It's fine, you can have that belief, but gender identity as a concept, I think, is a very unhealthy concept to teach to children because it teaches dissociation between mind and body. It's not a healthy way to conceptualize your difficult feelings in adolescence. It's probably the worst way you could do it. Why it spread so quickly is the total, relentless, unending indoctrination of children into believing that they're this thing called trans because of this thing called gender identity. So all of these invented terms have been, children have been bombarded with for at least the last 5 years, online and now also in schools, and they're being taught this as fact. So it's not surprising we're teaching children to have gender identity issues. We're saying it's a good thing to explore your gender identity. Well, you never used to have to do that. It's not, it's a task for this generation apparently, and that's supposed to be okay. Explore your gender identity. Well, you don't have one. You just... and because what it means is you have to analyse, it's this navel-gazing analysis of every single aspect of your personality to think, does that make me a boy or does that make me a girl? I can't think of anything that would create mental ill health more than gender identity.
And just one final point, the idea that there is anything progressive about this is complete rubbish. It's the most regressive system of ideas I've ever heard of.
Yeah. Okay, John?
So, well, one progression around this that has happened, I don't call it progressive, but it's a progression, has been the generations of the DSM and the ICD. So DSM from 2 to 5 and ICD, what number are they on, 11 now, something like that. But I got schooled by trans activists for still calling it a disorder or dysphoria or a mental health condition. And I was at a conference of psychiatrists and trans people in 2012, which called for the depathologization of trans. And the model for it was the depathologization of gay. And the mental health model has kind of put trans into that same category and followed through on it, and it's just taken 2 decades longer and several editions of the DSM and ICD, etc., to do the same work. And so the language has changed from everything from transvestic fetishism to gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria to now gender incongruence, and that is the current term. And I don't even know what the last one means. But yeah, it's really, really difficult because actually I stood against the depathologization of trans, and I still do, because it is comorbid with so many other things. It has to be explored, and also trans people are shooting themselves in the foot because if they do want it to be depathologized, they lose entirely all of the legitimization of the funding. I was married to a psychiatrist for 15 years. First do no harm. How do you get the surgeon to do harm to a healthy body except by giving him a psychological cause? He's not going to do it unless he's really unethical and just wants the money. And it's then essentially cosmetic surgery, in which case you've got to pay for it yourself. So you can't have your cake and eat it in that sense. So you can't depathologise.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, very interesting points raised earlier. It's not amazing that the founding members of Stonewall have been so horrified by some of these campaigns, because the way of totalitarianism and despotism is to win the battle of language. And they think they're winning the battle of language, some of these activists on the other side. And I think what we're looking at is a fundamental issue here, which is the traducing and undermining of the centrality of women, and particularly lesbian women. This is what will happen and is happening now. And I think that is something worth fighting for. In terms of the language, the reason we've not been able to draft a bill for 5 years is it's impossible to draft a bill. Because the assault on free speech and in the integrity of professional teachers, therapists, parents and others will be so fatally undermined by this legislation. You only need to look at what's happened in Victoria. If I could just read you a very quick passage from a legal opinion from Jason Koppel, KC, who's a human rights specialist. And he says, quote, "Any prohibition of conversion therapy going beyond the existing criminal law raises serious issues of compatibility with the Human Rights Convention under Articles 8, 9, 10 and 11 and the European Convention on Human Rights and Legislation." So essentially, trying to ban people's thoughts and prayers is impossible in terms of laying down primary legislation. In terms of, I'm quite amused that you should think I've got the inside track on the Labour Party's view on this.
One politician, another politician.
No. Now, on a serious point, Anneliese Dodds, who's the Women and Equality spokesperson, did a year or so ago put forward the proposal that there should be these legitimate carve-outs, including prayer and therapy and that kind of thing. She has sadly taken a very much stronger and more hardline and draconian approach in the last few weeks, probably under pressure from her own activists and key people in the Commons in particular. And I think that's a shame. The big strategic issue for those of us who are opposed to this legislation is it better to get a completely unworkable, useless, collapsed out piece of legislation in place, which is subject to huge litigation, judicial review, etc., which Labour would very wisely say, no, that's a mangy old donkey that's going to die on its own merits, or we stop the legislation now because it's a Pandora's box or a Trojan horse or any other classical allusion that you want, and then Labour come in with a much tougher, more draconian, more totalitarian piece of legislation. That's for you to make a value judgment on. I think Labour are likely to let the Tories beat each other up about it. I'm not convinced, even in a first term with a big Labour majority, that they will legislate for this.
Yeah, just briefly on this exorcism point that you raised, because, I mean, there doesn't seem to be evidence that it's happening on a widespread level, but it could be happening and it's a problem. But the problem with that is coercion. And in a sense, it doesn't matter whether they're trying to coerce someone out of being trans, or you know, in some sects, exorcism is used on people with drug addictions or just general delinquency. You know, you don't have to think, well, they have the right to be a drug addict or delinquent to say, well, it's wrong to use coercion to try and change their behaviour in that way, because it's not the behaviour that's the issue, it's the coercion. I think it's important to maintain that. We do have laws about that. It's not easy to enforce necessarily. But that's the point to emphasise, I think. Just a little point on this question about why trans is treated differently from something like an eating disorder. I mean, there's an obvious answer to that, which is that if you go along with the ideology, this is who someone is. And nobody says that an eating disorder is who you are, but that is a sincerely held belief by a substantial proportion of people. And I think you don't have to agree with it to recognise it becomes a conscience issue. If someone feels in good conscience, this is who this person is. So we have to negotiate that. I won't speak to clinical practice or the law, but I think in terms of the debate, it's very important that we entertain that so that we can have it out.
Could I just answer just the lady over there who asked about tomboys? This is very personal for us. Many lesbians like me, like Kate, and many of us within LGB Alliance wanted to be boys, thought we were boys at various times when we were young, and we are so grateful that we are not growing up in this period when we would have wanted testosterone, double mastectomies, the lot. You know, we're very grateful that we grew up in a different time.
And on top of that, I'd say it also is, it's weird these days that that whole notion that we would grow out of things is now regarded as being an unsayable point. Whereas I wanted to do lots of things when I was young, a pony being one of them.
You know, the whole field of developmental psychology is being thrown out of the water, thrown into the water here.
Exactly. At the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I had gender dysphoria for the best part of 30 years of my life. And much like most people with gender dysphoria, like I think it's way over 90%, will grow out of it naturally in their late 20s or usually sooner. And so that's what happened to me. And so it is unequivocally a mental health disorder. I completely agree with this lady here that it's we should be treating it like other mental health disorders like anorexia and so on. The fact that you made, which I appreciate, saying, well, it's the sense of who they are, but the problem is we're treating it like it's something that someone is when it's something that people go out of. It's not a fundamental thing like, I don't know, being black or something that's just an ingrained part of them that's never going to change, or, I don't know, having another condition like Down syndrome or something that we should say, oh, well, you can't, you know, if that person goes through the doctors, you know, the doctor wouldn't try and cure them of being black or cure them of having Down syndrome. We all know that's offensive because it actually is who they are. This is something, a mental health condition that people grow out of if they're given the space, as these ladies have been saying, to, just to talk about it, to think about it. I also am glad that I wasn't born 10 years earlier because I definitely would have. I'm autistic, so autistic people, again, very high percentage of people with gender dysphoria, they're very black and white, they're thinking, they're very absolutist, and yes, that's why a lot of them are like, that the solution is double mastectomy. If I get all these things, all the, you know, tick all the boxes, then I'll be all right. So I think that's really important. And in line with the mental health condition thing, it's, when I say we should treat it like a mental health condition, I think that you do need to pathologise it in that way, but we need to treat it in the same way we treat those things. So maybe this is where I diverge from Katie John a little bit, but our treatment for anorexia isn't affirming it and giving liposuction. And so we can pathologise it, but also give them what's actually statistically proven to help, which is this exploratory therapy.
Hi there, just a really quick question for Bev, I guess. You mentioned that there seems to be this three-part process they're trying to put through: self-ID, hate speech laws, and the banning of conversion therapy. Would you mind expanding on where you think this three-part thing is leading if it came into effect?
I'm a parent of a child who's been caught up in this, and I am one of the people whose child was born at the right time, at the wrong time, born before it was really in the public psyche. We were blindsided. I work with Keith with Our Duty, and many of our parents were blindsided by this if you have a child of the kind of age mine is now. But the parents are never involved in these conversations. I mean, I'm extremely grateful to the panel today, but particularly to Stephanie and to Bev for standing up for parents. But parents are the ones who should be on this panel. We are unheard. We are unheard and unseen, and our children and our families' lives are being utterly destroyed. Every single day there are families whose lives are being wrecked by this. The schools are complicit, the doctors are complicit, the health service are complicit, CAMS is complicit, everybody is complicit in destroying our children's lives, and they are telling us that we, the parents, do not know best. They have instructed our children that they should think about who they are. Oh, you like a dress, so you must be a boy. You must be a girl if you're a boy. And as you've just said, We have told children now that they need to think about who they are. We never thought about who we are. Gender dysphoria didn't exist when I was growing up. Nobody asked me. I was a tomboy too, and I'm damn sure I would have been transed away. It is an utter scandal, and I can only hope that the people on the panel and everybody else who has any kind of influence in this will put an end to this. You're absolutely right. The T has nothing to do with being homosexual. It has nothing to do with anything else. It is a fabricated sort of ideology. And, you know, there were always a very, very few people, and they were generally men, who would get into middle age and just be really uncomfortable and would want to present as a woman. And that's a sort of taking on a gender stereotype. But this idea, I mean, that even trans, what does trans mean now? There's a whole gamut of what it means. But the young people who are caught up in this now and have been sold this lie in school that they can be in the wrong body and change sex, it is an utter disgrace.
I very much go along with what Bev and Stephanie have said about transing away the gay. However, I thought that Katie had some really important points to make and had raised concerns that I hadn't heard before about the phrase transing away the gay, and I'd very much like to hear more from Katie on that.
At the end.
Thank you very much. I'm from Critical Therapy Antidote, and thank you for rooting for us, Stephanie. I'm a clinical psychologist, originally from South Africa, now in Ireland. There's nothing special about gender identity disorder when you realize that there are 3 other thought disorders related to the body. It is pseudocyesis or false pregnancy. It is body dysmorphia, that you mentioned. And it is body integrity identity disorder. What these 4 disorders have in common is an impairment of integrating reality into your subjectivity. I'm psychoanalytically trained. Psychoanalysis has gone woke. I'm a heretic for speaking the truth. The old Freudians, Freud wrote about this 100 years ago, that our basic achievement is to integrate the reality principle while contending with our urges, namely the pleasure principle. And that is the aim of psychotherapy, that we ask the question, why does this person have an impairment of integrating reality into their subjectivity? What is the unconscious trying to tell us? And you asked the question, but why is it such an issue? Why is gender identity such a problem? One word, it's a huge word. Democratization. They changed the disorder into an identity. And because they made it an identity, challenging the disorder is equated to challenging the existence of the person. And that is what makes this conversation so difficult. It's these ideological, agenda-driven word and mind games that we first need to understand before we can adequately unravel what these dark magicians are trying to do. And I agree with you. More parents on a panel and psychoanalysts, psychotherapists on a panel too. Thank you very much.
Now, sadly, because we're out of time, and also because that's one of the most brilliant contributions I have ever heard on this issue, I'm going to go back to the panel. And we have to wrap up. But I'm really sorry. Let's try and get this on the agenda again next year. Thank you very much. So, let's start from the opposite end of the panel. Is there anything that you want to address? If there isn't, feel that you can skip over it because we need to be out of here in 10 minutes. Yeah.
I'll just end with reiterating my point about the moral Overton window. I think there's been a deliberate attempt to narrow it and to force political opinions into the sphere of moral disapprobation. I think it's important that we push back against that and have more open moral debate, even things about things that make us even more uncomfortable than the trans issue.
Well, just to sum up, we've had a big discussion about transgenderism, inverted commas. I think that is a massively important issue and very unresolved before we go forward with new laws. Some of you, many of you may be atheists, but you believe in free speech. Religious freedom is under threat here. There's no need to legislate because we've already got legislation in place. It's going to be impossible to legislate because it will undoubtedly infringe the human rights of people. Where we've seen it happen abroad, in Victoria in Australia, it's been a catastrophe for parental rights, professional rights and free speech. So I would finally say to you, we still do live in a parliamentary democracy. For those of you who really care about this issue, please do write to your members of parliament and, where appropriate, members of the House of Lords, because we have a long way to go before, for those of us who believe it, we can defeat this legislation and protect the rights of people to have impartial therapy, but also to have their free speech respected, religious or not. So write to your MPs, and thank you very much for your time.
If I can segue from that and from this excellent contribution here, yeah, we live in a parliamentary democracy, not a psychiatric democracy. And I like that kind of democratisation of diagnosis and the fact that we've turned illnesses into identities and things like that. I'm not afraid to say those words. I get completely cancelled for saying them. But I spend a lot of time associating with the profession, seeking help from the profession, being married to the profession. So I'm comfortable talking in that area. But I can't talk about that area with people from my own so-called community. There's no such thing as the trans community. There's loud TRA voices, and then there's multiple other communities. And there are a lot of silent trans voices who message me privately saying, Katie, we agree with you, but we're definitely not saying it in public. But that's true of all of the stuff that we get. I do think it's important to not leap into, this is some of the stuff that's come through on multiple panels this weekend, to not leap into the stereotyping, the typing of all trans, all lesbians, all people seeking help and therapy, that not all trans are secretly gay. And if there was something someone said about gender identity is by definition a change of sexuality. Yes, it is, but it's both converting from straight to gay and gay to straight. It is definition. The definition is changing sexuality as well, because it is based on sex. So, but it goes both ways. And the percentages of the numbers they've looked at in the gender identity clinics of people coming in and going out, and also recognising that sometimes 6 months after surgery, people change sexuality, because the change of hormones alone can shift it, or allow people the freedom to explore what they didn't allow themselves the freedom to explore before. So. And what I want to finish with very, very quickly there is to be a student of history, both a student of psychiatric history and not just the modern era, but the previous era. Go back and read the insights into kind of homosexuality and transsexuality from the 1860s to the 1920s. And in that era, we didn't have LGBTIQA, the labels per se. We had a lot of people exploring sexuality and gender and sex and intersex and drag, both sides and directions and everything within all of that. And it was an era in which there wasn't this compartmentalization, but there was also a freedom to explore before it was all squashed by a certain group of people in the 1930s. But it was an era in which things were expressed. And I think if we can root things on expression, but not so much on this massive thing about you are what you say you are and now you've got to change to it, the more space we can give, the more time we can give, then people can grow out of it, for whom the right thing is absolutely to grow out of it. And for those that carry on living for decades and decades and decades and there's no solution in sight, then I do see being trans as in that sense as a last resort, not a first option off the shelf, pick and mix.
I think adding gender identity to a conversion therapy bill would really mandate the gender affirmative approach towards children, which is going on now, and that is the problem. So we would be exacerbating the problem that everybody's seeing that's being revealed. It wouldn't only be pointless, it would do harm. It's the opposite of what we need. When we're thinking about gender affirmation, what are we actually affirming? We are affirming a teenage girl's body hatred, dissociation, rejection of self, hatred of self, body distress. we're welcoming the boy that she becomes, and we're saying, you're right, you should reject that girl, she was awful. What a message to give to teenage girls and boys. Let's be clear about what affirmation means. That's what you're doing, you're affirming that distress. I think the idea of gender identity and trans, it has not only made normal adolescent distress into a cool identity with a flag, it's politicized a condition of growth. It politicizes children, it politicizes all children actually, because all children are taught it and in schools are sort of compelled to believe it. Jeremy Hyam KC, who gave us the legal opinion, came to the conclusion that because of the lack of evidence and the fact that it's neither proportionate nor necessary, but crucially would be in breach of parental rights, his conclusion was that it would be highly unlikely to be unlawful as a bill.
Just a few points about integrating reality into subjectivity. I think as a parent and as a grandparent, I would hope that parents would be able to at least monitor, if not limit, their children's the time they spend on social media, online, where it becomes extremely difficult to distinguish reality from the online universe that they encounter and that many of them live in far too much of their lives. Secondly, please be aware of these language games, and when people use words like trans rights, or when people say gender identity, ask them actually, I mean, you don't have to be hostile about it, just say actually, what do you mean? So that they can explain what they mean, because quite often they don't know what they mean. Please contact your MP. We heard yesterday, or the day before yesterday, at our LGB Alliance conference, from an MP who said that he had received 150 letters from constituents who want a bill to ban conversion therapy, and he had received 3 from people who didn't. So for heaven's sake, please get writing, because it is the MPs are getting the impression that this is what the public wants, and we know that that isn't the case. Please, when people say LGBT, would you point out that those letters don't belong together? We are separating LGB from TQ and all these other identity-based labels which have nothing to do with sexual orientation. Please go to the website of LGB Alliance to see what we, as gays, lesbians and bisexuals who know what sexual orientation is and know that what homosexuality is, what we think about the plans for a conversion therapy bill. Thank you very much.